Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Advanced PHP with MySQL course. In today's lesson, we're going to be learning about a new SQL command known as the update command. We're going to be going over what an update command or an update statement looks like, which is used, as the name implies, to update information in the database. Basically what it does is it updates information for a particular set of rows in a database. We're going to talk about how to use the update, how to run an update query from PHP script, and then we're going to go over two built-in functions into PHP, HTML special chars, and add slashes, which are two functions that are used to to be able to effectively retrieve information from a database to output it, and then also to add information, to be able to appropriately add information to a database. So as mentioned, an update statement is basically used to update data values for specific rows in the database, in a table in the database. It has the following syntax here. It basically is the keyword update followed by the name of the table that you're trying to update rows on. So this is saying update rows in the items table. And then it has the set keyword. And basically what then you do is you have a comma separated list of column names with the values you want to set them to. So for example, this is saying update the rows in the items table and set the column name equal to and set the column name to have the value blue t-shirt, and set the price value equal to $8.99 for any row where, and again it makes use of a where clause, where item ID equals 1001. So what this entire query here is saying is update the item 1001 row in the items table so that its name is blue t-shirt and then its price is $8.99. Again, just to point out, notice that our strings are enclosed in single quotation marks. The where clause operates just like for select statements, and also as we have done in our delete statements, so it can use comparison and logical operators. So you can actually update multiple rows at the same time in a database. For example, maybe instead of saying where item ID equals 1001, you could say, using a comparison operator, where item ID is less than 1004. Now this may not be something you want to do, but just as an example, this would say, so update all the rows in the items table, set their name value equal to blue t-shirt, set the price equal to $8.99 for all of the items where the item ID is less than 1004, so you'd actually update multiple rows. If you want to update column values for all of the rows in a table, for example, let's say we wanted to update, we've switched over our website, so all of our image files are now JPEG. So all of our item image files are JPEG, and they have JPEG extension. Well, you could run this update statement here, and you just leave out the where clause, and that's going to update every row in the table. So this is going to say update all of the rows and items, and set the column value image file extension for each row equal to the value, the string JPEG, JPG. And you notice that there's no where clause here, or where statement, and what that's going to do is basically make that updated statement apply to all the rows in the table. So let's take a look at, I've logged into our MySQL monitor so we can play with the database. And if let's take a look at what we have in our items table, for example. So this is the information we have about the particular items. Let's say we want to update our baseball bat row to just be a baseball. Let's say the item actually represents a baseball now. Well, what we can do is we can say update the items table. We want to set the name column equal to just baseball, and we want to do that for all rows where the item ID equals 1003. Because that item ID is a primary key, we know that this update statement is only going to apply to one row, and when we run it, it's going to say query was okay, one row was affected, one row was matched, one row was changed. If we run our select query again, we can see that now item 1003 is called baseball. One thing to note is that if you let's say we try to run the same query again, where we're trying to update the name of it, it's going to say that one row matched. It found one row that matched this where clause, but it wasn't changed because nothing changed in it. So it's going to say 0 rows affected. And that's going to come up when we talk about how to use these update statements from PHP, because we use the affected rows property of our MySQLi object to sometimes determine whether a query was successful or not. So even though a query may be successful in that it assures that the data is set to updated to how you want it, might not affect any rows if the data actually did not change. So the way we run an update query from PHP is the same as we do for our insert and delete queries. They don't return a result set. We basically can test the return value of query to it's a truth value to see whether it was successful or not. It returns true if the update was successful, false if it wasn't. We can also check the affected rows property of our MySQLi object. And what that allows us to do is to see the number of rows that were updated. Now, as mentioned, the first time you run the query, if you're actually changing information, it'll let you know the number of rows that were changed. If you run it again, affected rows is going to say 0 if you update the same data. So that's something you have to consider when you're testing on whether you want to when you decide how to test if an update was successful or not. So assuming we already have a connection to our database, as the DB variable, it's a MySQLi object. It's already connected to our advanced PHP database. If we have this query here, update items, set price equal to 15, there's no where clause on this query, so this is going to update all of the rows in our items table, and it's basically going to say set the price of every item in the table to 15. We're going to run the query. This results variable can be tested for true or false to see whether the update succeeded or not, and then we can also output the number of rows that were affected by the query. So in this case, if we had 6 items in our table, affected rows would say 6 the first time it was run. The second time it was run, it would actually report 0. So let's go take a look at a script we've created that shows how to use this in PHP. It's just called updateItem.php. It follows sort of the 4, as with any SQL queries, you have the sort of 4 steps that you go through when running a MySQL query. Connect to the database, you run the query, process the results, close the connection. So we have in the beginning of the script our connection to the database. Then we run our SQL statement. In this case, we're running a static statement that's just saying update the items table, set the price equal to $0 where the item ID equals 1001. So basically we're saying update item 1001 so that its price is 0. We run the query. We test that only one row was updated because it's the where clause specifies a primary key value. We know it should only update one row. The first time we run this, if the query is successful, it's going to return that one row is affected, and then we're going to be able to output the number of rows affected was. Now, if we run it a second time, as you'll see, it's going to show that actually it'll show what would be may consider an error. There's an error updating the item, and that's because it's just trying to update the same information again, and it doesn't affect any of the rows. Then we simply close our database connection. So if we look at the state of our items table again, we can see that item 1001 currently has a price of $15. So if we go ahead and we run this first example that's going to run that query, we can see the number of rows updated was 1. Let us know that the query was successful. If we go and look at our items table again, we can see now that the price of the item 1001 has been set to 0, so the update query was successful. If we try to refresh the page, which is going to try to run that query again, we're going to get that error message. There was an error updating the item, and so that's not necessarily an error, but it's because no rows were affected, and we were testing on the affected rows property. So that's just something you need to consider. And if we look at our items table, nothing has changed, and so that's why it shows up as 0 rows affected. So one of the things, PHP provides a special function called HTML special chars, and basically what that does is that encodes any special characters or characters that have special meaning in HTML into the proper HTML entities. So for example, if we have data stored in our database that contains a double quote or a less than sign or a greater than sign or an and sign, those are special characters in HTML. So if we were to extract the data, like let's say load the information about an item from the database and output it on a page, if it contains a quote character, that might affect how our HTML is going to look. So for example, let's say we have an input, we have a text box, and we want to set the value of it. And then what we might have here would be a PHP statement. Let's just say it was down here. That's going to echo, for example, the name variable. Let's say the name variable contains a double quote. Well, what's going to happen is then we're actually going to get output from PHP. And this is leaving out the rest of the attributes just so it's less to write. Let's say name was equal to, actually, the name Joe in double quotation marks. So what's going to happen is it's going to output this first double quote. When it's going to output because that's just part of what's included as our HTML, when it echoes the name, it's going to output the name string, which is going to be Joe enclosed in double quotes. So it's actually just going to output this. We're going to have the double ending quotation mark here, and then the closing script. So what's going to happen is when this gets interpreted by your browser, when it gets sent to your browser, it's going to see that the value input actually has no value supplied for it, because this quotation mark that was included as part of the string we pulled from the database contains a quotation mark. So that's a special character in HTML, and then it closes attributes. So that's going to mess up how our HTML is interpreted. The same thing, for example, if we had a less than or greater than sign, if that was part of our code, for example, and maybe it was included in here, that might cause problems with HTML thinking, okay, this input tag has been closed. So what HTML has, for those of you who don't know, they have special entities that are called, which are basically these little sequences like this that you can use to represent those characters without them being interpreted as HTML characters. So for example, if we wanted to output Joe in parentheses as an actual value, Joe in quotation marks, we could actually do it like this. So what that's going to do is when your browser interprets this HTML, it knows how to interpret these HTML entities, and it knows that when it encounters ampersand sign followed by QUOT followed by a semicolon, that it should just output a double quotation character, and it's not meant to be a character that's closing the attribute value. So basically, if your data contains these types of, if string data contains these types of characters, you're going to want to basically escape them or turn them into these HTML entities so that they're properly interpreted. And so the HTML chars function does that. You provide it with a string. Maybe it's a string you've read from your database, or that's what we're going to be using it for, a string we've read from our database. And what it does is it takes that string, and if it finds any quotation marks in it, or any less than signs, or greater than signs, or ampersand signs, it goes ahead and it translates them into these appropriate entities and generates that string. So basically, you sort of run this as a filter around data you're pulling from your database before you output it via an echo statement to your HTML script. So if we look at a new version of our item, update item.php, and if we take a look at the script, it's a little bit different in that it's going to make use of our item class that we've been using in our database. And basically what the first thing it's going to do is it's going to allow us to choose an item to update. And we do that by entering an item ID here. So it's kind of got three different parts to it. I might select item 1002, and we're going to say show item. And what that's going to do is, in this particular case, we're just going to be updating the name just for this example rather than all the other properties of the item. And it's going to output the name in our in this text box that shows what the current name of our item is, because we want to update that. So we want to know what it is, and maybe we want to change it. Let's say 42-inch LCD, even though it's kind of implied color television, and we go to update the item, it's going to update the name of that item in our database. So this script kind of has three different parts to it. It has one where you select the item, has another one where you it outputs what the current value of the name of the item is, and then allows you to try and update the item in the database. Well, if we look at our script here, so it kind of has three parts based on an action variable that we're going to be using. That's going to either be show item, that's going to be either a null, show item, or update item based on which part of the script we're running through. In our data processing section, we go ahead and we connect to the database. If the action is show item, then what we do is we actually run a select query on the database to load the information about the particular item. In this particular case, we're interested in the name of the item, but we go ahead and we build up an item object that contains all of that information. And then in our section down here, where it says show item, we go ahead and we are outputting the information about the particular item. Now, the thing that we're going to be doing is, you'll notice that in our text box, we want to output the current value of the name of the item, so that when we go to the script, we can see what it currently looks like. So what we've done is, in our text box, in the value attribute, we've outputted an echo statement that outputs the name of the item, and it basically accesses this item object that we built up at the beginning of the script, and it runs it through this HTML special chars function that's going to basically escape all of any special characters so that we don't run into any problems. One other thing to note is that it also passes along here the item ID, because what's going to happen is when we submit this form, we're going to want to be updating the name of that particular item in our table. We need to be able to identify which item we want to update. We use that by the primary key, which is the item ID. So we actually output here as a hidden input field the item ID that we're going to update. When it gets resubmitted with the update item, after we've changed the name, we hit update item, it's going to get resubmitted with an action that's going to be called update item. So in our processing section, then what it's going to do is create a query that's going to update the name of that particular item, and that's where we get, and these are processes, form variables up here. They're processes get variables, item ID and name for the name and item ID of our item. And basically what it does is it says set the name of our particular item in the items table equal to whatever the name was set to, where item ID equals item ID. So that's basically saying update that, the name column of that particular item, of the item row represented by this item ID, and then if there's no error, it goes ahead and it goes down to the output section, which basically updates a message that says the item was updated successfully, as we saw. So if we look at the current status of our database, we can see we have 42-inch color television, $599.99. Well, let's say we wanted to update the name of that. Actually, let's say we, well, right now if we look at it, let's take a look at what that script looks like. If we go back and select item 1002 and click show item, now this has actually a special character and it has a quotation mark, so that is going to get escaped or turned into an entity by our HTML special chars. So if we actually look at the HTML, we can see here's that and QUOT semicolon that's representing that quotation mark that's basically letting your browser know that it's not a quotation mark to close the value attribute, but it's just a quotation mark to be output as is. And so that's how the HTML special characters works. Well, let's say we were to go and actually get rid of that HTML special chars function call. Now if we try to load item 1002 and we click show item, you're going to see that all it shows is 42. And why is that? Well, if we look at the source and we blow it up, we can see that this quotation mark, this double quote, was not turned into an entity, so HTML interpreted it as the closing quotation mark for this value attribute. So it shows the value of this input box as just being 42, and then it figures out how it's going to interpret the rest of this malformed HTML. And so that's why it shows only 42 in the box on our screen. And so that's the importance of where HTML special chars comes in. We go ahead and redo the change. Oops. We're going to see that now that the quotation mark is going to show back up. I think I might have just set it to 42. Let me check. Yeah, that's why it actually got set to just 42. So let's reset it to LCD television. If we update it, now when we look back in our database, we can see that it's back to the way it was because we've updated and re-added that HTML special cares function. When we go ahead and try to show item 1002 and it outputs a value, it's going to successfully output that quotation mark. And we can see that it was turned into that HTML entity and QUOT semicolon. So that's a function for taking information from a database and outputting it to a user so that it's appropriately seen within HTML. Now we're going to talk about a function that's built into PHP called add slashes, which is used when you're taking user input from an HTML form, for example, and you're going to be including that as part of a query to insert or update information in the database. Well, as we know with our strings, when we insert strings into the database, for example, if we have this insert into function, or let's say we have this test table, for example, and it takes one value. Well, if we want to insert about the string can't, we know that for string data types we have to enclose them in single quotes, and if we want to include as part of that string a single quote, we have to escape it using the / single quote character. Well, that's what the add slashes function does. Let's say we have a form, the same form where we're able to update the name of a particular item, and let's say the user inputs, they want to have the name of the item include some data that's enclosed in single quotation marks. Well, we want those single quotes stored as part of that string in the database. However, when we create our query, we need to escape those because in our query that we typically generate within, for example, our PHP code, we just enclose it in single quotes. Now, if this data gets inserted as is, it's going to show up like this, and that's going to cause a problem with our SQL query because now we have a malformed SQL query because basically this apostrophe or single quote that's part of the string we're trying to insert is basically telling MySQL, okay, this value ends right here, and then this part here is going to be malformed and it's going to cause an error. So we need to properly escape that. So what you can do is you can pass your user input as a string into this add slashes function, and it's going to go ahead and look for any single quotes and then double quotes as well and properly escape them with the /, replace all of the single quotes with the / single quote, all of the double quotes with the / double quote. So if we look at our item, a new version of update item.php, in our old version, the one we had just looked at, in the section at the beginning where we run the update query in the data processing section, let me find it. Basically what we're doing is we're creating this update query and we're just taking this name variable, which is just the get variable name that was supplied on the form. So it was whatever was supplied in this field right here, which could include single quotes or double quotes. And we just output it as is into this query without properly escaping it. Well, in our new version, we do the same thing, except we basically take that name variable and we run it through the add slashes function and then use that properly escaped variable within our string, our query string. So the functionality of the script is the same, except it's added that add slashes. So let's say we wanted to say 42 inch, and then we wanted LCD to be in single quotation marks, television. Oops, on the wrong example. Actually, let's update item 1003. I think it's a baseball bat. Let's say for whatever reason we want our title to be enclosed in single quotes. Well, when we update our, first of all, let's look at verify right now in our database. Baseball is the name associated with item 1003 is just baseball with no quotations around it. So if we want to update that to have it single quotations, we can run our update item function. Now it's going to say it was successfully updated. And if we look in our database, we can see that baseball is now enclosed in single quotation marks. Let's say, however, that we actually used the last version that didn't have add slashes. So going back to example 2, now when we try to update 1003, we're going to be able to successfully see it. Just to change things up, let's put 2 double quotes, single quotes at the beginning, or maybe with the space in between them. Now when we go to update item, the reason it didn't get an error is because these quotes cancel each other out. So actually, let's go back to example 3, where we can actually comment out the add slashes function. So if we go back to item.php, item 1003, baseball is back to the way it was before, because that query I just ran actually changed it. And if we go ahead and we eliminate this add slashes function, now what's going to happen is when we try to, let's say we want to name it baseballs. Let's see. Yeah, we'll just call it baseballs with a single quote in it. And when we go to update item, we don't have that add slashes. This isn't going to properly escape. It's going to cause a problem with our SQL syntax, and it's going to say there's an error with the update query. So actually, if we go ahead and take a look at what that query looks like by just simply echoing it, we'll be able to see the problem that happened without using that add slashes method. We can see that what happened here is because our string, the new name that we included, baseballs, had a single quotation mark in it, when we tried to just include that in the query as is, SQL is going to interpret this apostrophe or single quote that's a part of our string as the closing single quote for this name column, and then that's going to cause this to be a malformed SQL statement, and that's why it's going to throw an error. So when we add our add slashes back to it, what it's going to do is it's going to escape that. So if we go back to our script, re-add add slashes, and then take a look at the query that we've actually generated properly, and we refresh, we're going to say it was successfully updated, and if we look, we can see that add slashes properly escaped that single quote character so that the SQL statement was properly formed. So for the homework challenge, basically I want you to mimic sort of what we did in this in this lecture, except do it on the people database that we've been using in our homework examples. I want you to create a script called updateperson.php, and it's basically going to follow the form that we used in the example today. When you first load the form, if it doesn't have an action specified, it's going to present you with a text box where you can enter the person ID of a person you want to update. When you submit the form, you're going to submit it with an action that says show person, for example. And what that's going to do is you're going to go ahead and then run a select query, load that person from the database, and then output a name text box and an age text box that allow you to update the name and age of that particular person. One thing to note is that in that name and age box, I want you to also output, as we did in our update example, for example, item 1002, I want you to output the current name of the item's name, the current person's name and the current person's age, because that's what you'd expect on an update form. And so in order to do that, you're going to run a select query that's going to allow you to pull that information out, and then you're going to output it as the value of those text boxes. Then when basically you're going to provide an update person button, the person can click on that, and then basically it's going to go ahead and run an update query that's going to update the name and age of the person to whatever the user entered on the form. And so basically the form is going to take a couple of different variables. It's going to take an action form, which is an action variable, which is going to control whether you're initially just putting a text box to say what person ID do you want us to load the person for, whether it's showing the person that allows you to edit it, or whether it's actually performing the update action. It'll have a person ID form variable, which is what you're going to enter to select a person to update. And then I want you to have two form variables that are going to be array form variables that are called person, and then name and age, which refer correspondingly to the name and age of the person that you're trying to update. And then basically, whenever the action form variable is not equal to show person or update person, just output that single text box. Basically, this is just an explanation of what I was saying is how to process the different parts of the form, where you go from selecting the person ID to the form where you can update its information, and then the form where you actually click the button update, where it's going to go and run the update query. And so basically, when you do this, I want you to make sure that you use the HTML special cares function. You're going to need to use that on the page where you're showing the person, where you're outputting those text boxes that show the current name and age of the person, because maybe their name, for example, might contain a single quote. And it may not be the best example for that, but it's an example of using that, of how to properly output text from a database. So I want you to use that on, for example, the part of the script where the action is show item. And then on the part of the script where the action is update the item, I want to make sure you use the add slashes method to properly escape any name or age information that was submitted on the form by the user, so that you don't get errors in your update statement. And I'd actually like you to, when you go ahead and update the name, for example, of a particular person, go ahead and make up some name that includes a single quotation in it, for example. And that way you can make sure that your add slashes works, and try it with and without the add slashes function, and see that you get that error, and then see that when you do the add slashes, it appropriately escapes that query, and then it's able to successfully run. And that should give you practice with running these update queries, and then being able to use HTML special cares to properly pull data from the database for output, and use add slashes to properly add data to the database. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching educator.com, and look forward to seeing you next time.